organization based here in Atlanta called Digital Undivided. I'm excited for her comments and welcoming her to the stage. So Kathryn, welcome.
Good afternoon, Net Impact. I am so excited to be with you today. As I was walking throughout the conference, someone commented that I had a very dewy sunshine look. I want to thank that person. I'm wearing a new bronzer today. And wherever you are, hey, thank you. You've given me that extra boost to talk to you today about Path to Purpose, and specifically how a group of Black women and Latino men and white men and Black men disrupted the startup space. So I was born in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Anyone? Hey, where's Milwaukee at? Hey, Milwaukee, cheeseheads. I was born in Milwaukee, Wisconsin in the 1980s. My father was a brewery worker at Schlitz Brewery. Yeah, people know Schlitz. Wow, this is a good audience. Sunshine, Schlitz. And so this was in the 1980s. Milwaukee was very much a factory-based community. And those of you who've grown up in factory towns know that the factory was more than just a job. It was a community. We went to church together, Boy Scouts together, Girl Scouts together, had fabulous Christmas parties, things were great. So you can imagine how devastated Milwaukee was when the factory shut down. And it was a really difficult time, not just for the city, but for also my family. But my father had this big vision of himself, a vision that was much bigger than what others had placed on him as a Black man in 1980s middle America. And so he found himself at a workforce development center called OIC. Now, OIC was a national initiative of sort of workforce transition centers that were located throughout the Midwest and on the East Coast. And there he fell in love. He met C++. C++, for those of you who don't know, is one of the foundational computer programming languages. And my dad was in heaven. And he really had an aptitude. He took a course taught by a gentleman from IBM who, for whatever reason, thought, I'm going to give up my Saturdays and teach a group of displaced factory workers how to code. From there, my dad got an internship, an unpaid internship at 36. Can you imagine that? At IBM. And then got a job at Digital Equipment, which was one of the early, somebody knows Digital? My goodness, this is a great, Digital Equipment was one of the early personal computing companies. It was later bought by Compaq, which was bought by Hewlett-Packard, so it was many, many years ago. And from there, my family moved to Minneapolis. So I grew up on the rough and tumble, hey, Minneapolis. You are my people. So I grew up on the rough and tumble streets of Minneapolis, Minnesota. And since Prince wasn't hiring musically challenged teenagers, I left. I went to undergrad at Rutgers. I went to graduate school at Yale, where I got a graduate degree in epidemiology. So I spent years working as an epidemiologist throughout Southern Africa. It wasn't that cool. It was cool, but not that cool. And it was while working as an epidemiologist that I had the call that no one wants to get, and that was that I had a sick parent. And I had to move back to the States. Now, around this time, I also happened to meet a gentleman and fell in love. So I was a newlywed going through this really big transition, had a death of a parent, trying to figure out what I was going to do with my life. I was working as an epidemiologist in Philadelphia and still just kind of trying to figure out what am I going to do. I was 24 years old. I was going to dedicate my life to traveling abroad and couldn't do it anymore. And so my husband, who he's here today, I think he's maybe out so I can say this, he put the F in frugal, and really, and he said, you know, you're spending a lot of money, sister. We need you to get it together so that we can build this life. And so he said, hey, you like shopping, you like fashion, why don't you start something called a blog? Now, this was 2003. There was no WordPress. Everything had to be hand-coded. So I would go in to Nordstrom's Rack, take a picture. I had to sneak into my husband's office because they had a T1 line. At that time, most home-based internet was so super slow, it would take me 5 hours just to scan a picture. I had to then code that picture in HTML. I had to then use PHP to link it to a MySQL database that I had to build, all to have one picture of a pair of shoes I bought at Nordstrom's to show up online. So you can imagine what it was like back in the day. But the blog took off. It was called The Budget Fashionista. It led to lots of TV and amazing things. It led to red carpets. You can't see it, but to the right of me is Jermaine Jackson in that picture, and his hairline, yeah, it was very interesting. And so as well, running The Budget Fashionista, which at that point had grown to a staff of 5, that I had this idea that I was going to start a startup. I was receiving a lot of emails from people who were doing really interesting things. Companies like Birchbox and Guild Group were right at their beginning, and they were sending me emails to help them promote. And I said, hey, I can do something similar. I knew that Black women purchased over 40% of all the hair care products here in the United States. All the hair care products, right? I thought, wow, and technology wasn't servicing this market. Let me do something. So I had an idea to start a sort of Birchbox for Black women. And I entered into one of the early incubator accelerator programs in New York City. And I was so, so excited. I'm like, yes, this is my $1 million idea. I'm going to be the next Oprah. It was the first time in my life that I felt invisible. When I was in this accelerator program, I was one of only 4 women. I was the only brown person, the only person with any sort of tan even in it. No one would talk to me. No one would talk to me. Now, I grew up in Minneapolis, where talking is a sport. So I wasn't used to people not speaking to me, and I was definitely didn't have a problem with being the only person of color in the room. And many, many crazy things happened to me as part of this tech accelerator. And some of the really interesting stories was a white male colleague told me that he didn't think I could relate to other Black women because I had an accountant, and I guess Black women don't have accountants. One investor who prides himself, even to this day, in supporting women-led companies said to me that he didn't do the Black woman thing. And in light of what's going on right now in our nation, I obviously did not stay around to ask him what he meant by do. I moved on from that. But it really had an impact on me, and it stuck with me. I later sold my company, and I went to go work for a women's-led organization, a women-led startup called BlogHer, which represented over 40 million women influencers. And it was there that I learned how to build a company and how to scale a company. I learned from people who had did it before me. But this idea, my experience in that accelerator stuck with me. I could not shake it. And so it was while there that I started Digital Undivided. Digital Undivided is a social enterprise that works in helping Black and Latina women own their work through entrepreneurship and innovation. And we've had quite a bit of interesting success. We focus on 3 primary goals, which is to help Black and Latina women founders be confident. We want our founders to be able to come into any room, whether it be 5 people or whether it be hundreds of people like you, and to be able to confidently talk about their companies, confidently be able to access the investment. We also focus on data. We're big data people. I am actually using my Yale degree for something. And so we do a lot of reports, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. And then also, we know that we serve as role models for other Black and Latina women to show what the possibilities are. It is difficult to be what you can't see, so we make sure that we are seen and that others in our communities know that you can build a company. You don't have to be a Mark Zuckerberg. You can be a Marquita Zuckerberg and still be able to do. And so, thank you. Our impact, over 56 companies, over 20 million. we realized, though, in the middle of doing our work, that it was difficult for us to really communicate what we were doing, mostly because there was no data, there was no numbers. And it's very difficult to solve a problem that you can't quantify. And so we went and we quantified the problem. And we started what is called Project Diane. It's a data initiative that looks at women of color, tech, startups, and innovation in the United States primarily. We're in the middle of our second report. Our first report came out in 2016. And the data from Project Diane was actually quite striking. What we found was the average raised by a Black woman founder was $36,000, while the average raised by mostly white, mostly failed startups was $1.3 million. So we weren't even really raising enough to fail properly. And to go back to what Carrie was saying about this investment problem, it is a big problem. We found that only 0.2% of all investment dollars have been invested in companies led by Black women. Black women are approximately 7% of the US population. Another really interesting thing, and this is something that always blows people's mind when I talk about this, particularly in Silicon Valley, is that the schools that Black women founders come from are different than the schools that, again, mostly white, mostly male, successful founders come from. And this was particularly interesting for me. Stanford University and Spelman University, which is less than a mile away from here, produced the same number of Black women founders. And so at the end of our project, one of the things that really came through was that there's this sort of challenge. There's three sort of areas that make a viable ecosystem, particularly in the innovation space, but also pretty much in any space. And that is training, network, and funding, access to capital. And what we found for women of color, that was completely missing. So you might have training over here, a couple of training programs over here, you might have some funding over here, maybe a network or two, but they weren't really connected, and that was a problem. And what we do at Digital Undivided is bringing all of that together. So what did we learn? And we've learned a lot since we've been in existence. We've been in existence since 2012. And the first thing we learned, I think this is probably the most important, is that everyone, all of us here, wants to lead a creative life that we can control. And in our case, it was entrepreneurship and innovation was the tool by which people were doing it, but it could be any sort of tool. But at the heart, we want to lead these lives and we want to be able to control it, and everybody wants that. We also learned that the path for women of color is different than the path for others. When we first started our program, we used other programs that were in existence as a sort of template. We used the Y Combinators and Techstars. And what we realized is the paths through those programs are not the same as the path through our program. And that people of color, particularly women of color, had different obstacles and different challenges. And that the program that we did had to be reconfigured to address those problems and challenges. We also learned that money was a problem, but it wasn't the problem. And what I mean by that was we learned that there were other challenges within our community around money. Access to money, what is equity? For a community that's never really received investment before, how do you receive investment? How do you interact with investors? What does that even mean? We realized there was a lot of assumptions around money that were going on in our community, and also for those external to our community, and there was a lot of education that we had to do around those concepts. And last, but certainly not least, we also learned that in order for us to be different, we also had to think different. We were thinking, even as an organization, we were thinking in the ways that people told us to think. Many in our organization have all gone to graduate schools, some of which are represented here today. And we realized that the problem that we were facing was pretty unique, and that we had to be unique in our thought in order to be able to solve it. And so I want to leave you with one of my favorite quotes, and it's a quote that I live by. It's by an author named Marianne Williamson. And I'm going to paraphrase the quote, but it's a really powerful quote, and it is, when you shine, when you show who you are and are empowered in who you are, you give others the permission to shine as well. And I want to give a charge to each and every one of you here today to please shine. Our nation needs you to shine. And by you shining and you standing in who you are and doing what you do, you are giving the permission for others to do the same. Thank you. Oh my God.
It was amazing.